the RAS Project, a conversation about life, entrepreneurship, personal development, family tech, and marketing. My name is Ivan Temelkov, and I'm your host. What's in this podcast for you? Here you will find life-changing advice to help you level up every aspect of your life and business to help you reach your goals and dreams. As always, all content is 100% real, raw, and unfiltered. And today, I have a very special guest on the episode who I'm excited to chat with. Her name is Emily Formea, and she is a mindset coach for women struggling with eating disorders or disorderly eating. She recovered from her own eating disorder of 9 years in 9 months and now has created a business, a blog, a book, and a brand around helping women with food. She graduated from college 2 years ago with a degree in political science, and she's originally from Southern Illinois and now a transplant to Boston, Massachusetts, where her favorite thing in the world is coffee. Welcome, Emily. How are you?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Yes, we love coffee here.
Absolutely. Who doesn't love coffee?
That's
I mean, let's face it. First of all, I'm a big fan of coffee, and these days I drink it black. And that's actually a huge shift because I used to love my Starbucks lattes, honestly, until I realized that there were $3 to $5 a pop. And let's just face it, when you have a couple of those a week, it just takes away from your bank account a little bit. So, plus it's not good for my intermittent fasting, which has been going very well for the last 8 or 9 months. And let's just face it, black coffee. I found Seattle's best, actually, to be the best, believe it or not, because it's actually the only coffee that doesn't give me heartburn, believe it or not. So thank you so much for coming on the show. Let's start a little bit about, tell us a little bit about yourself. Take us way back to, I want to hear more about the eating disorder. So how did that all happen?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm currently 23. I developed an eating disorder in the 7th grade when I was 12. I was actually diagnosed at that time with anorexia, which for people who aren't aware is kind of the more mainstream eating disorder where I just tried to eat as little as possible. So I lost about 50 pounds in 5 months and I found myself in the hospital. I was not doing well, as you can tell. And from there, I think I always struggled with food, but I didn't feel understood. And so it really hindered my recovery. So I struggled with anorexia for many years where I just didn't eat a lot, but then I would kind of shift and I would go through binge eating or emotional eating. And then I would shift and I would kind of count every calorie and start a new fad diet. And then I would shift again. And it just kind of took me all through high school and college. I just always struggled with food and I would see therapists or I was in inpatient back in 7th grade. And I always say I'm never downing medical professionals whatsoever. Right. I just think that there was a big misunderstanding and misconception with my eating disorder. And then with millions of women now in the same position where I just always struggled with food, but I felt misunderstood because it wasn't really the food. And that's kind of what I now coach on in my own business.
Yeah. It's really interesting you were talking about the anorexic disorder, right? Is this that, so when you said you lost 50 pounds, I'm making an assumption here. So you had to be between 50 and 70 pounds, roughly. I mean, that's a very dangerous weight, right? Yeah. Hence why you landed in the hospital is because you weren't stable, right? So what was, okay, as you knew you had this disorder, and let's face it, you probably didn't have much control over it. I mean, you knew that you wanted to fix it, but you didn't really know how. What really got you thinking into well, first of all, to help yourself, what was going through your mind when you knew that, okay, I've got this eating disorder, I need to fix it? What was going through your mind, in trying to figure out a solution for it?
Yeah. So I definitely think it was one of those perfect storms, which I talk a lot about, is I had the personality profile where I was a perfectionist. I'm a very type A type of person. I say I'm high strung, I'm very organized. And so if I set my mind to something, I'm going to achieve it. And unfortunately, I think in our society now, especially young women, we're given this formula of also having the perfect diet and the perfect body. So
Yeah.
I think it was just this perfect storm. And this is, I now speak to millions of people who felt the same way as me. I didn't fit the
Yeah.
profile necessarily of like, I'm just really sad and I don't eat enough. Like there was so much more going on to it. I just felt like I had to control absolutely everything in my life to be good enough.
Yeah.
And it ended up, yeah, it took control over me and ended me in the hospital. And I remember being back in that time really truly believing that I didn't have a problem. Like I
Sure.
really believed that kind of just everyone was supposed to count calories and everyone was supposed to try to be a
Yeah.
size 0. And this was just my way of kind of coping with feeling anxious or feeling upset or feeling like that not good enough.
Yeah.
So I think when I was in it, I definitely knew that I struggled with food, but I didn't really understand that you weren't supposed to. And that's why I say, like, I speak on eating disorders and disorderly eating, because
Hmm.
I think there's just this kind of veil of like, everyone is always on a diet. Everyone is always supposed to be thinking about what they're eating. Like, that's normal, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So, yeah, in the time, I didn't really think, I knew that I had gone a little bit too aggressive. But when I left the hospital, I was actually supposed to be in the hospital for 3 weeks, and I left in about 4 days because I
Hmm.
was just kind of a high achieving kid. Like I had great grades.
Wow.
I was super like involved in my school. I just didn't fit that
Yeah.
profile. And so I was kind of like, oh, I don't know, I'm just not very hungry, and kind of just went on with my life because there was this major gap of understanding, I think,
Hmm.
in eating disorder recovery.
So one of the reasons that I asked that is because it's really interesting that you talked about how I think women don't necessarily kind of. I think it's between men and women. There's a difference in realizing that you have an eating disorder, or you maybe not eating healthy enough. Just I think it's the way that we perceive it between men and women. It's just our way of thinking and approaching it. So I was just curious in knowing, like, how did you approach it, and how did you start thinking about a solution and realizing that, that I do have a disorder, an eating disorder, and how should I approach it? How should I resolve it? How do I get it under control,
Mhm.
right? One thing that I wanted to talk about before actually I forget here is, as I was reading through your bio, actually. So, and this is something that's really unique about you. So, you mentioned that you graduated with a political science degree. So, like, it's really interesting, political science, and then doing this, right?
Yeah.
Now being a coach, and helping women with eating disorders, which kind of goes to show, like, okay, great, I did the degree thing, but by the way, I'm going to do something different, right? Which
Uh-huh.
all too familiar, because it's exactly what I did. Is kind of veered into a different direction. But you also, something interesting about you is when you moved out to DC, you worked for the House of Representatives
Mhm.
for
I
9 months.
did.
Okay, how did that happen? Let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah. So I can kind of go. So in college, I was studying political science. I actually graduated in 3 years because I had gotten an internship to go out and work for the House of Representatives for like the summer time. And I
Mm,
thought, oh my gosh, this is my dream. Like I should graduate and go out there and try to just get a full-time job. So I graduated in 3 years with my bachelor's in political science. I moved out to DC. And during this time, I was struggling with food still. Like everything in my life was quote unquote perfect, but I was always counting calories and over exercising and all of this. So I moved out to DC. I did work for the House for 9 months. I adored like everyone I met. It just wasn't really
yeah,
for me. And I think like, I
sure.
know your podcast is so much about entrepreneurship as well. I think it's really cool because looking back on my story, I always had a passion to help people, but I didn't
Hmm.
know how. So I went into college just kind of being like, sure, I'll do politics, I guess. Like, and I just picked a career with my always like intention behind it. So I moved out to DC and I hated it. And I like definitely
Yeah.
went through kind of this like, then I'm the problem. Like, why do I not like this? I studied this. This
Mm,
was supposed to be my dream, forgetting that I could always use my kind of goal of helping people in different ways. And if politics wasn't it, that was okay. So that was actually my
yeah.
crash, which is what spiked my recovery. Because I think I
Mm,
was finally faced with like, who am I? What's going on? I hate political science. I just graduated in this degree. I hate struggling with food. Like it really, really pushed me to just kind of have a fork in the road and go, and like, this is the advice I give to people who
Yeah.
really just want to take that step towards recovery. It was like, you can keep struggling. Like, it's pretty painful. You know that your eating disorder is painful
Sure.
and it ends in pain. It has this entire time. Or you can choose recovery, and it's also painful. Like, I'll never say recovery is easy. It's super
Right.
painful, but it ends in pain free. So I was kind of just at this fork of like, okay, it's my decision. And they're both not great, but one of them is totally worth it. And
Yeah.
one has kept me in this cycle for 10 years.
So there's a few things, and I was trying to make a mental note as you were making that statement that I think are really important to mention here, because I think as human beings, we all experience these things. So going back to you going to college and studying political science, I think it was the push of what traditionally in the world we've been taught, right? Is let's think about it. It's when you're growing up, you're being told go to school, get good grades, get married, have a family, have a house, couple of cars, save some money in the bank. What's the fun in that? That's the traditional way of living, right? So I think, based on what you were saying, is that you were sort of stargazed by the House of Representatives because, hey, it's the House of Representatives. This is an opportunity of a lifetime. But then as you got into it, you started to realize, you know what, this isn't my true calling. This isn't my why. This isn't my purpose. And I will tell you this, there's even successful people out there who make millions of dollars that hate what they're doing because they haven't truly found their why and their purpose. I know I've worked for some people who run successful companies, but they're miserable because they're just at this point maintaining status quo because they think that's the only way to live a life. And honestly, that's a very, very saddening way to live a life because you know what? When you're staring in the face of death, and let's face it, it's inevitable. We're all going to die. No, I don't care who you are, as long as you're a human being, you're going to die one day, right? But when you're staring at the face of death and you reflect and you look back at your life, what would you want to remember? Would you want to be happy and say, you know what? I did this. I really enjoyed it. I accomplished that. We'll just say, you know what? I worked for a job. I made a lot of money, but I was miserable as fuck.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
I think
like
it's the
that's
same. Yeah. It's the same thing
exactly.
with eating disorders. It totally is. You
Yep.
have this image of like,
Right.
okay, so this is what I'm supposed to look like to be happy. And then you try and you try and you try. And I think
Yep.
unfortunately what happens is you actually do get it. Just like that example with like people who climb the quote unquote like 9 to 5 ladder. You
Yeah.
can do it. What's so heartbreaking to me is that then when you do it, you still don't have the feelings that you thought it would bring you, and you do a 180 and you blame
Yeah.
yourself, not the formula of society. You go, oh my gosh, then like I must be the worst and I suck. Why didn't I do this? The whole being good enough, like that was
Yeah.
me. Every single time I would lose 5 more pounds, I felt 80% worse. Like I was like, I'm
Well,
still unhappy.
I think it was the victim card. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I think females play that card more than males do because let's face it, we live actually in a very self-centric, predominantly male-driven world. In fact, anytime I have a female on the show, I'm excited because it's a breath of fresh air because I mostly have dudes on the show. Not that it's, nothing wrong with having dudes, but like the female perspective is great. Also, it's an attributing factor to society, to the world. It brings a different perspective. But I think that, let's face it, as a female, you've got this prefabricated image that I'm supposed to look good, I'm supposed to exercise, I'm supposed to eat well, I'm supposed to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
That is complete bullshit. Like no woman should be doing that. Honestly, it's a choice, right? But a lot of women also struggle with that. There's an actual real problem, especially believe it or not in the United States. You probably noticed over 60% of people are obese, and largely because fast food is accessible. I can take my ass down to the McDonald's drive-thru and get me a fucking cheeseburger for $1, right? Who wants to make a sandwich, right? Who wants to spend 10 minutes making something healthier, right? So yeah, it is very challenging for women,
Yeah.
right?
And I love that you brought up victim, because I use that Well, at first, it was very hard for me to
Mm-hmm.
say, like, I was a victim to my eating disorder. But I think victim has such a negative connotation. In reality, it's
Yeah.
the most empowering thing you can say because you're finally taking your voice back. Like, the way that I explain the victimhood of women with diet culture is we hear this voice in our heads that says, like, don't eat carbs, carbs are bad. And then we go, okay, and we just kind of like do it. Like we don't ever,
Yeah.
I once read a quote that was like, as much as you listen to your brain, you can talk back to it just as much. And we
Yeah.
just don't. Like we hear it, we listen to these commercials about like, do this slim fast, take this diet pill, do this, whatever. And we go, okay. And we just don't think for ourselves. Like I truly and when someone once said to me, like, are you playing victim to your disorder? I got so mad. I was like, how dare you? Like, this
Mm-hmm.
is so hard. Like, you have no idea. And then I realized that I truly was. And that gave me the empowerment to, holy shit, like that means I can talk back to it. And that means I can change it. This isn't how it always
Yeah.
has to be.
Well, I think the reason you were talking about that quote and being able to talk back to your brain is I think, especially females, I think are so concerned with the outsider perception from the world, and worrying about the judgment. And I will tell you this, especially from a life and from an entrepreneurial standpoint too, is the minute I turned off the news, the minute I turned off more of social media, and I do a lot of personal branding, but as soon as I turned off, like, I don't give two shits about what someone else thinks, like really focusing on myself. I even did a Facebook Live about it earlier today, is the minute you focus on yourself, like really dial yourself in. Like personally, 6 years ago when I started cycling, still to this day, I have no fucking idea how that happened. And it wasn't really about the endurance factor for me. It was about the mindset aspect of it. And every time I feel like I'm lost, every time I feel like I need clarity or focus, I'm out on the bike doing 20, 30, 40 miles, sometimes close to 100 miles per week, pedaling on the bike because it gives me clarity. It gives me focus. It gives me peace. And
Yeah.
I think that for women and being a husband also, I said that in my wife personally, is just that the internal struggles that there are, the internal battles. And I think women, and this is probably unintentional, fail to be expressive about it and fail to be vocal about it because they're worried about the judgment that people are going to pass upon them. And that's, I think, exactly what you were talking about, is about playing that victim card upon yourself, right? And saying, it's my fault, immediately, right? Because I think women do more of that than men do. Because men are like, I don't give a shit, I'll eat a freaking Twinkie or whatever. Women are like, well, feeling depressed, feeling stressed out, and then you take to food, and then you play the victim card, right? So I think with the eating disorder is, I think you said that there was a lot of that happening, right? Until you realize that no, the victim card is not a solution. I need to start thinking more solution oriented in terms of how am I going to get out of this rut? How am I going to change my eating habits? And I have the power to do that. Nobody else,
Yeah.
but you have the power to do that. And honestly, whether you're a male or a female, you have the power to do so many things. People don't realize how much potential they have until they get so dialed in, and then realize, holy shit, I didn't know I could do that. Because they're
Yeah.
so worried about the minutia of mediocrity of society. I mean, we've really seen it with everything that's been happening with this pandemic, and 5 million people filing for unemployment because they're scared shitless. I mean, that's an indication that there's a lot of fear in America, both for male and female, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just, whether you have an eating disorder or you're an entrepreneur, but it's all around. It's just on a grander scale, right? So going back to, the reason I had to ask about the House of Representatives is just to kind of emphasize on the fact that I think too many people are stargaze, like, when you're young and you're like, I want to be an astronaut, or I want to be a lawyer, or I want to be a doctor. And then, maybe your parents are lawyers and maybe they're doctors. And then they kind of want you to follow in their footsteps. I know as an Eastern European, my family wanted me to go to college. I decided to drop out of college and go out and do my own thing, But years later, and even though my father's an entrepreneur as well, he's starting to come around, and now with having a full-time employee on board too, he's like, oh shit. He's like, it makes it more believable, right? But it's believable because you're gaining traction. And most people will be in disbelief, especially when you're battling your own battles, not just with an eating disorder, but just battling your own battles, because everybody has them, whether it's stress or depression or eating disorder or being overweight or whatever it might be. Everyone has them. We're all human beings. And this is in part why this podcast exists, is to bring on people like you to talk about different things and share, perspective. So let's talk about how you help women specifically, okay? Because there's just literally, what I think I probably need to do for the rest of the year is book more females for my podcast, because I feel like you guys bring so much, a fresh perspective, right, to the podcast. Let's talk about when you work with women, like what specific things do you help them overcome?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I want to say, like, I also like totally am aware that men struggle with food too. Like I always say that like eating disorders do not discriminate, but I specifically work with women just because I don't have a degree. I only have my experience, and I only have my experience as a woman. So I just always like to say that, like, I'm here to talk and listen to anyone. I just that's my actual business, is working with women. I think it's interesting because I actually don't. When I first started my business, of course, I had like the mind drama of who am I to do this? I have no degree in therapy. I have no degree in eating disorders. Like I truly had all of that. Yeah, the voice, like just, and me being like, yeah, you're right. And then I realized, and like to anyone who wants to, be an entrepreneur or just really do anything in life, I realized that like I was my first client. I had done it. So whenever I said like, I don't have a degree, I don't have the money, I don't have all of these things, I was truly the one that had a really bad eating disorder, struggled with food, and then didn't. And that was all the proof I needed to believe in myself. And I think I love that you touched on the belief factor as well, because there's two major things that I work with my clients. One of them is that self-deprecative language and action and bullying yourself and hating yourself is never going to bring about self-confidence or self-certainty, or like the mathematical equation is just off. If you put in a whole bunch of just like negativity and hatred towards yourself, and like, this is people who struggle with any mental illness, people who struggle with overeating, undereating, like debt, any type of like struggle that you're going to go through in life, the worst thing you can do is to also turn on yourself, because then nobody's supporting you and nobody believes in you. And so I think that's the first thing I help them do, is release the guilt and the shame, and I help them disassociate from their disorder, because eating disorders, from my experience, I always thought I was the problem. I was the issue. I was the failure. Like I identified with all of these things. And as you can disconnect that, you start to support yourself to almost fight off your disorder. So I think that's the first thing that's like really important to do. And the second thing is to I truly think just validate what they're saying. Like, I think I've somewhat become the girl that gets it. That's what that's what a lot of my clients call me. And that's what I always wanted to be, because at the end of the day, I just so deeply understand how they're feeling, what their fear is, what's going to come up next, like as they go through recovery, that I'm aware of, where they are here, and they can somewhat see me as where they will truly be. I think it's so powerful to talk to people and hear people, because this helped me in my recovery, of people who have done it, not just studied it. And that's like the whole argument with like, go to college or build your own business. Like people who have done it and taken those actions are limitless, and because there's just certain things that you can't study in a book.
Well, a couple of things I want to touch upon, because I can 100% relate to everything you just said. First of all, I think the reason you work with women is because they're relatable. You're a female yourself, and like you said, you have been your own client. So now you're actually a testimonial of yourself. And that's probably one of the best testimonials that you can have, is to say, I have done it. I have achieved this. If I can achieve it, I can show you how to do it, right? You have to believe in it, which that's a whole nother story. But then you were talking about education. I mean, I'm a guy who got my education from the school of Google. I shit you not. And, if that's not enough, is 6 years ago, I was brought on to build a curriculum of a continuing education program at the University of Missouri in St. Louis for search engine optimization, search engine marketing, because I learned all of that through Google, practiced it within companies that I worked for, and then generated seasonality and experience. And I will tell you this, these days, now more than ever, this is probably going to change. Companies hire on experience. They still care about degrees, but now more than ever, they don't give two shits. In fact, some of the best gamers in the world don't have any official education. They make like $100,000 per year, sitting in a gaming chair every single day because they're passionate about it. They love what they're doing. And that's what companies want. They want people who are genuinely passionate and they're the best at what they do. Because the reality about education, and mind you, I follow guys like Gary Vaynerchuk who talk about, the education system is so behind, right? Is that you're going to learn more on the internet than you're going to learn because you have practicality. You can have practicality. Whereas the traditional environment is you get education, but you got no practicality. And that's what companies want, right? So I think the reason you've also veered off is just that relatable, your target audience were women. Secondly, is just that you were passionate about what you were doing and you knew what you were doing and you could replicate it. Well, that's a recipe for a business in itself, to where you can teach other women how to do that. And honestly, there's a lot of women out there that struggle with eating disorders, and a vast majority of them are unwilling to admit it. And another thing you also mentioned is I think a lot of women struggle with self-confidence. And I even talked about it earlier today on my Facebook Live, is this that, if you don't believe in yourself, you can't ask others to believe in you. They won't. It's just how it works, because you don't come across as confident. You don't come across sometimes as assertive, and they get the sense that you know what you're talking about. So you got to work on your self-confidence. That is the biggest thing. And honestly, I'm also prime proof of that, because the last 2 months, my business has grown tremendously when everybody else is probably collecting unemployment checks, So that's another thing. And I think it's equally true for women. You got to build that self-confidence. Not just for women, it's really for anyone. You got to have self-confidence, especially as an entrepreneur. If you want to build a business, if you're passionate about something and you want to share it into the world. So it's great that you mentioned that, so let's talk a little bit about, on the self-confidence side is, what are some things that you encounter specifically, just to get even bit, more specific, with the types of different women that you work with, when it comes to eating disorders?
Yeah, so I definitely I think this is when diet culture really kind of plays the main role in kind of this like the eating disorder fairy tale is what I call it. We see on social media and we see online, we see on TV, all of these all the media, that very thin, beautiful, attractive women have perfect lives, and that everyone loves them, and that the way that they get super thin and model-esque is by dieting. And so then when you have me at 12 and millions of other women at 12 going, oh, like my body's starting to change, right? I'm experiencing insecurity. Oh, interesting. What a great solution. I'll just diet, look like that, and life will be fine. And it is the weirdest phenomenon I've ever really looked at from an outer lens now. Of then you take that sort of formula and you also take that women more often than not are just more high strung. We are usually more type A. We're more people pleasing. We're just kind of more malleable in the sense of our self-worth and our self-confidence. So then you take this major, group of individuals and you create $1 billion industry off of it, off of saying that if you don't feel good, go on a diet. If you lack self-confidence in your body, we'll just change your body, not realizing that what we're lacking is emotions. And so it's not going to make a difference. I always use the example when I weighed my lowest weight, which had always, of course, been my goal weight. And I was like, this will make me so happy. Everything will be fixed. The world will be glamorous. I was more insecure in my body than I've ever been in my entire life, because my problem wasn't my body. My problem wasn't my food. And I think women, with the confidence factor of it, we just at the right age of kind of being unsure of who we are just force fed oh, well, then just change a couple things in your diet. And the other thing with food struggles is if you do it once, you're going to do it your whole life. Because if you've adopted the belief that the problem is with your weight, if you a year later run into a problem, you're going to think, I should go on a diet. It becomes a coping mechanism, just like alcoholism, just like, overeating, like it just becomes your kind of default of how to cope with not feeling good enough, instead of raising women especially to understand that like feeling bad doesn't make you bad, and that being
Right.
perfect is like an illusion. Like instead of raising women to have a sense of self-certainty, I think self-certainty and self-compassion are the two that I talk about the most. We're just kind of thrown into the ringer with like, oh, but just go on a diet. And
Yeah.
that's exactly what happened to me.
Well, that was a really, really great powerhouse of a segment right there in itself. And actually, kind of goes hand in hand with exactly what, I was hoping to chat with you about, which is, the perfectionism mantra that I think has been kind of created, especially for women, like you talked about. And also the fact that, the need to always be in control and to know that you are good enough, right? Everyone is good enough, especially women. You are good enough, but you can always improve if you want to. That's a choice you can make. Nobody's forcing you to do that, but that's, I think, what you help women do is realize that they have a choice because everyone's good enough. I mean, I know, especially when I talk to my wife, right? I said, whether you choose to eat healthier, totally up to you. You're going to feel better because I know when I shifted with my eating habits is, I curb my heartburn. That's in part why I drink Seattle's best coffee, is because a lot of people don't know that Starbucks coffee is actually burnt. And that's in part what gives you heartburn. They burn it for the darker, richer flavor. A lot of people don't know that. In fact, I had a guy probably a couple of years ago or so on the podcast that actually was starting a coffee company, a bean company, and was kind of educating me on that too. So with that being said, I'm really excited that I had you on the podcast to talk about all of this, and especially how you help women with eating disorders and creating solutions, because there are a lot of women out there who struggle with that. Before we wrap things up on this episode, let's throw out some handles. How can people connect with you out there, especially women who want to establish that self-confidence, and maybe they have an eating disorder as well?
Yeah, no, this has been so great. I really have I could talk about this forever.
Absolutely.
And you can find me I have a website, which is probably the easiest. It's
Okay.
www.sincerelyxoemily. My Gmail account is the same way. So you can email me at sincerelyxoemily@gmail. And then the final one is my Instagram. It's sincerelyxoemily, but there's periods. So it's sincerely period XO period Emily, because the other one was taken. But
Awesome.
yeah, please feel free to reach out to me. And I always say as well, even if you're questioning it, because I get this a lot from women where they say, well, I just eat clean, but I'm pretty okay with food. If you're even questioning it, I really, really encourage you to still reach out to not even me, to someone, because having fully a life of food freedom is so, so different than being oh, I'm on a diet and it's fine. So I really want to
Yeah.
encourage you that you don't have to struggle with food in any way, and you do deserve to recover from however you do struggle with food.
Well, Emily, thank you so much.
Thank you
I've
so
really
much.
enjoyed this conversation. And first of all, I want to say congratulations also once again to developing the self-confidence and the mindset, and really enforcing the willpower to overcome this eating disorder, and also get you on track to where you feel more fulfilled and happy in
Mhm.
everything that you're doing in life.
Yeah, thank you so much. I so appreciate it.